which the company had hoped for. But before the ship sailed, Smith, who was still considered in disgrace, and therefore kept out of the council, insisted on having a fair trial, for he would not have Captain Newport go home and spread evil stories about him. Smith's enemies were unwilling to allow the trial, but Smith would take no denial. So at length his request was granted, the result being that he was proved innocent of every charge against him, and was at length admitted to the council. Now at last something like peace was restored, and Captain Newport set sail for home. He promised to make all speed he could, and to be back in 5 months' time. And indeed he had need to hasten, for the journey outward had been so long, the supply of food so scant, that already it was giving out. And when Captain Newport sailed it was plain that the colonists had not food enough to last 15 weeks. Such food it was, too. It consisted chiefly of worm-eaten grain. A pint was served out daily for each man, and this, boiled and made into a sort of porridge, formed their chief food. Their drink was cold water. For tea and coffee were unknown in those days, and beer they had none. To men used to the beer and beef of England in plenty, this indeed seemed meagre diet. "Had we been as free of all sins as gluttony and drunkenness," says Smith, "we might have been canonized as saints. Our wheat having fried some 26 weeks in the ship's hold contained as many worms as grains, so that we might truly call it rather so much bran than corn. Our drink was water, our lodging castles in the air." There was fish enough in the river, game enough in the woods, but the birds and beasts were so wild, and the men so unskilful and ignorant in ways of shooting and trapping, that they succeeded in catching very little. Besides which there were few among the colonists who had any idea of what work meant. More than half the company were gentlemen adventurers, dare-devil, shiftless men, who had joined the expedition in search of excitement, with no idea of labouring with their hands. Badly fed, unused to the heat of a Virginian summer, the men soon fell ill. Their tents were rotten, their houses yet unbuilt. Trees remained unfelled, the land untilled, while the men lay on the bare ground about the fort, groaning and in misery. Many died, and soon those who remained were so feeble that they had scarce strength to bury the dead, or even to crawl to the common kettle for their daily measure of porridge. In their misery the men became suspicious and jealous, and once more quarrels were rife. Wingfield had never been loved. Now many grew to hate him, for they believed that while they starved he kept back for his own use secret stores of oil and wine and other dainties. No explanations were of any avail, and he was deposed from his office of president, and another chosen in his place. As autumn drew on the misery began to lessen, for the Indians, whose corn was now ripe, began to bring it to the fort to barter it for chisels and beads and other trifles. Wild fowl, too, such as ducks and geese, swarmed in the river. So with good food and cooler weather the sick soon began to mend. Energy returned to them, and once more they found strength to build and thatch their houses. And, led by Smith, they made many expeditions among the Indians, bringing back great stores of venison, wild turkeys, bread and grain in exchange for beads, hatchets, bells, and other knickknacks. But all the misery through which the colonists had passed had taught them nothing. They took no thought for the time to come when food might again be scarce. They took no care of it, but feasted daily on good bread, fish and fowl, and wild beasts as fat as we could eat them, says Smith. Now one December day Smith set out on an exploring expedition up the Chickahominy River. It was a hard journey, for the river was so overgrown with trees that the men had to hew a path for the little vessel. At length the bark could go no further, so Smith left it and went on in a canoe with only 2 Englishmen and 2 Indians as guides. For a time all went well, but one day he and his companions went ashore to camp. While the others were preparing a meal, Smith, taking one of the Indians with him, went on to explore a little further. But he had not gone far when he heard the wild, blood-curdling war whoop of the Indians. Guessing at once that they had come against him, he resolved to sell his life as dearly as might be. So seizing the Indian guide he tied his arm fast to his own with his garters. Then with pistol in his right hand, and holding the Indian in front of him as a shield, he pushed as rapidly as he could in the direction of the camp. Arrows flew round him thick and fast, but Smith's good buff coat turned them aside. The whole forest was alive with Indians, but although from the shelter of the trees they showered arrows upon Smith, none dared approach him to take him. For they knew and dreaded the terrible fire stick which he held in his hand. Smith fired again and yet again as he retreated, and more than one Indian fell, never more to rise. He kept his eyes upon the bushes and trees, trying to catch glimpses of the dusky figures as they skulked among them, and paid little heed to the path he was taking, so suddenly he found himself floundering in a quagmire. Still he fought for dear life, and as long as he held his pistol no red man dared come near to take him. But at length, chilled and wet and half dead with cold, unable to go further, he saw it was useless to resist longer, so he tossed away his pistol. At once the savages closed in upon him and, dragging him out of the quagmire, led him to their chief. Smith had given in because he knew that one man stuck in a quagmire could not hope to keep 300 Indians long at bay. But he had sharp wits as well as a steady hand, and with them he still fought for his life. As soon as he was brought before the chief he whipped out his compass, and showing it to the chief, explained to him that it always pointed north. And thus the white men were able to find their way through the pathless desert. To the Indians this seemed like magic. They marveled greatly at the shining needle, which they could see so plainly and yet not touch. Seeing their interest, Smith went on to explain other marvels of the sun and moon and stars, and the roundness of the earth, until those who heard were quite sure he was a great medicine man. Thus Smith fought for his life, but at length, utterly exhausted, he could say no more. So while the chief still held the little ivory compass and watched the quivering needle, his followers led Smith away to his own campfire. Here lay the other white men dead, thrust through with many arrows, and here the Indians warmed and chafed his benumbed body, and treated him with all the kindness they knew. But that brought Smith little comfort, for he knew it was the Indian way. A famous warrior might be sure of kindness at their hands, if they meant in the end to slay him with awful torture. And so, thoroughly warmed and restored, in less than an hour Smith found himself fast bound to a tree, while grim warriors, terribly painted, danced around him, bows and arrows in hand. They were about to slay him when the chief, holding up the compass, bade them lay down their weapons. Such a medicine man, he had decided, must not thus be slain. So Smith was unbound. For some weeks Smith was marched hither and thither from village to village. He was kindly enough treated, but he never knew how long the kindness would last, and he constantly expected death. Yet he was quite calm. He kept a journal, and in this he set down accounts of many strange sights he saw, not knowing if indeed they would ever be read. At length Smith was brought to the wigwam of the great Powhatan, the chief of chiefs, or emperor, as these simple English folk called him. To receive the white prisoner, the Powhatan put on his greatest bravery. Feathered and painted, and wearing a wide robe of raccoon skins, he sat upon a broad couch beside a fire. On either side of him sat one of his wives, and behind in grim array stood his warriors, row upon row. Behind them again stood the squaws. Their faces and shoulders were painted bright red, about their necks they wore chains of white beads, and on their heads the down of white birds. It was a weird scene, and the flickering firelight added to its strangeness. Silent and still as statues the warriors stood. Then as John Smith was led before the chief they raised a wild shout. As that died away to silence, one of the Powhatan's squaws rose and brought a basin of water to Smith. In this he washed his hands, and then another squaw brought him a bunch of feathers instead of a towel with which to dry them. After this the Indians feasted their prisoner with savage splendor. Then a long consultation